Hello and welcome to everyone present here. I am very pleased to welcome all of you today for the International Conference on Recent Trends in Social Science 2022 as part of Annual Research Conference of Science, Social Science, Commerce, Arts and Literature organized by Postgraduate Department of Economics in association with Research Committee and IQAC. Thank you to each and everyone for being here with us. My name is Binduja B and I have the privilege of being host today for the session. Before we get started, let's begin the formal section by evoking the blessings of Lord Almighty. So I request everybody to observe 1 minute silent prayer and Acharya Anusmarana. Now, I would like to call upon Sarida Ma'am, Assistant Professor of Department of Economics, to extend a warm vote of welcome. Welcome, ma'am.
Thank you, Binduja. It's my formality to welcome each one present over here. First of all, I like to welcome our beloved principal, Dr. V.M. Anand Kumar sir. He will be joining in between because he is busy with other conferences, other presentations also as well. So I welcome Dr. V.M. Anand Kumar, Principal, BTM NSS College. We used to hear a saying, you want to get somewhere, you should aim at the stars, shoot at the sky, and you will land somewhere on earth. But those who know Anand Kumar sir will change it like this. You aim at the stars, shoot at the sky, and definitely you will catch hold of a handful of stars. It is only because of his inspiration and his aspiration we could think of such a conference. We were hesitant because it's a rural institution, BTM NSS College. We could never thought of starting such a conference, and only because of his inspiration and his willpower, we could do such a conference. I welcome Dr. V.M. Anand Kumar sir to this presentation, this talk of Dr. Lekha Chakraborty. And today our resource person is Dr. Lekha Chakraborty, professor at NIPFP and member of the governing board of Managing International Institute of Public Finance, Munich, governing board of Management International Institute of Public Finance, Munich, Germany. And I feel so lucky to welcome ma'am because it was a long cherished dream for me to introduce ma'am to my students, my institution. She's an expert in public finance and macroeconomic analysis, and she is the pioneer in gender budgeting in India. Binduja will introduce ma'am in detail because this is not enough for her. When I think of ma'am, two words come to my mind: passion and compassion. That is how I like to introduce her. Her passion for her profession and her compassion for her fellow beings. And I feel so lucky that I am one among them who got a chance to know her compassion. And she is, even though when you check her career, it's growing like what I can say, an Everest, going moving forward, upward. But I know her as a friend, a teacher, a philosopher, and a poet. We cannot think of a better person to start our conference with. A hearty welcome from all of us, ma'am. I welcome Shama Pillai teacher, IQAC coordinator, and Dr. Bijini BR, Head Department of Physics and Research Committee convener. I welcome Dr. Sajini Jeevan, coordinator, Social Science Conference and Head Department of History. I welcome Sudhir sir, coordinator, Social Science Research and Head Department of Political Science. And also I welcome Dr. Kishore Raj, Head Department of Economics, and all teachers and students from my department and other departments. I welcome all participants from other institutions who joined us today on our invitation. Once again, welcome you all.
Thank you, ma'am. Now, I would like to invite our resource person, Dr. Lekha Chakraborty, Professor of National Institute of Public Finance and Policy and member of the Governing Board of Management, International Institute of Public Finance, Munich, for the talk. Lekha ma'am is also a pioneer economist in institutionalizing gender budgeting in India with Chief Economic Advisor to Ministry of Finance, Government of India in 2004. Her area of interest are macroeconomic analysis of public finance, fiscal federalism, gender budgeting, and so on. She is also the recipient of Info's Best PhD Thesis Award from IISc Bangalore. She also published several journals and articles. It's a proud privilege to have her as resource person, and today she will share her expert opinion on fiscal risk and global uncertainty. So once again, I welcome Dr. Lekha ma'am for the talk. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you. Bindu, am I audible?
Yes,
Yes,
ma'am.
ma'am. Now it's audible.
Okay. But thank you so much for having me. And as Sarita mentioned, it's a long dream. You know, ഞങ്ങൾ ഒരുപാട് നാളുകൾ കൊണ്ട് പ്ലാൻ ചെയ്യുന്നതാണ് NSS കോളേജിൽ വന്ന് കുട്ടികളോട് സരിതയുടെ കുട്ടികളോട് സംസാരിക്കണം എന്നുള്ളത് ഞങ്ങൾ കുറച്ച് നാളുകളോട് പ്ലാൻ ചെയ്യുന്ന ഒരു കാര്യമായിരുന്നു. പിന്നെ സരിത ഒരു കാര്യം എന്നോട് മെൻഷൻ ചെയ്തത്, മാം വളരെ തിരക്കല്ലേ, so how can we do that? But today morning I woke up, seeing her message that ma'am innana program. So that waking up process, despite all the busy schedules, to a student's call, that's very precious. And ini ennu vilichalum I will come back and talk to your students. And thank you so much for giving me this opportunity to talk to them.
Thank you, ma'am, so much.
Thank you, Sarita. And a special thanks to your principal and the college for sending me the formal invitation, and I value that. And students, I will be speaking to you today on the global fiscal risk, as Bindu mentioned. When we talk about am I audible and clear?
Yes,
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
audible.
Okay. So when I talk about this global financial risk or global fiscal risk, that background is the global uncertainties we have now. You can understand that the Ukraine war, the Russian war in Ukraine, that led to mounting inflationary pressures. Of course, that affected trade process. And along with that, the decisions taken by the US central bank, the Fed Reserve, in raising the interest rates in a series, and also the taper tantrum, which we are going to experience as an emerging country. These are the global uncertainties, which I have to put on board before I talk about the fiscal risk. In the sense, how we can respond to these global uncertainties. I mentioned that inflation is mounting, and how you respond to mounting inflation, central bank has to act upon it, right? But if central bank bite the bullet and increase the interest rates right now, that can affect the growth recovery process, after the pandemic. Or I do believe that the pandemic is over, but there is also, a talk that the next wave may peak in June, God forbid. But in this, extraordinary times, if central bank increases the interest rate to respond to the mounting inflationary pressures and the fear of capital flight, that is going to affect the growth recovery process. Because for the growth to recover, we need to keep the interest rates lower, and we need to boost investment through low interest rates, because credit has to be cheaper. But at the same time, the primary mandate of a central bank is price stability. And these global uncertainties, when the inflation is mounting, and when the prime objective or the primary objective of a central bank is price stability, they have to be hawkish. Hawkish means they have to increase the interest rate and respond to the inflationary pressures. And you can understand this dilemma. If you increase the interest rate, that will affect the growth recovery process. But if you keep the interest rate status quo and low, then how we are going to respond to the mounting inflationary pressures and the fear of capital flight. We fear that there will be a capital flight if our interest rate is not matching with the US interest rate, because a part of the foreign capital is always hot. It's a hot money. And hot money, by definition, respond to high interest rates. So if you don't increase the interest rate, then capital flight can happen. So this is a dilemma. Then the monetary policy stance has got this, uncertainty, or this, constraint in responding to the global pressures and the mounting inflationary pressures. There's a huge responsibility for the government, for the fiscal policy, to have, appropriate policies to respond to the mounting inflationary pressures and the global financial recovery and economic recovery. So what is that role? And if you are engaging in a fiscal profligacy or a huge macro fiscal program, then that lead to a kind of, that fiscal dominance can lead to a kind of fiscal risk. And that's exactly what I told Sarita, that I will talk to the students. What are the future fiscal risk? But, Sarita and me, we studied in CDS, Center for Development Studies, Trivandrum. So we are aware of a kind of economic paradigm which is not neoclassical. Neoclassical in the sense, they don't believe in huge fiscal deficit or huge, public debt. They do believe in a kind of, a strict fiscal discipline. And if the, fiscal deficit is high and the debt is high, they do believe that it crowds out, private investment in your country. But is that the case? Because you can understand that from the narratives of, our finance minister, that she refuted this neoclassical paradigm that high fiscal deficit and high debt, that's going to crowd out private investment. So that neoclassical paradigm has been refuted by, finance minister, in the sense she mentioned that high debt or high fiscal deficit, if it is used for enhancing the capital infrastructure in the economy, then it's going to crowd in private corporate investment. And I do, give importance to this argument, because even my book, and Binduja mentioned, even my book and the papers related to the deficit and its macroeconomic impact, when I looked into the questions related to what are the plausible macroeconomic impact of high fiscal deficit on the economy, my empirical evidence, my study, my book, you can read that chapter, on crowding in and crowding out. I got a result that a timely fiscal deficit is good. This I have written even prior to pandemic, but that time many economists were not in a mood, mainly neoclassical economists were not in a mood to listen to the argument that high fiscal deficit, a timely deficit, can be good for the economic recovery process. Now, the question is, what we do with that enhanced fiscal space we get through increased borrowing or increased fiscal deficit. That use of the fiscal space is quite important. If it is leading to the fiscal profligacy, of course, that is not the kind of argument we engage in, but the argument goes like this. What is the counterfactual? If you base your policy perspectives, on the assumption that revenue stability and revenue certainty is required for expenditure design and expenditure hike. If that is the case, when the revenues are not stable and when the revenues are uncertain, you mean to say that you have to curtail or you have to compress the expenditure? If that is the case, that expenditure compression can create, repercussions, adverse, implications in terms of economic growth recovery and in terms of, it may mount, humanitarian crisis. And that is the path to fiscal austerity measures. And in the time of pandemic, and when the economy is in recession, then getting into fiscal austerity measures, that's going to be detrimental. So we cannot say that where is the money? We don't have money, so we need to do expenditure compression. Why this is the case? It all comes from the question of fiscal rules or the macroeconomic framework you have for our country. What is that macro fiscal framework? It is based on a strict fiscal rule that 3% of GDP, that should be our fiscal deficit. So in the time of pandemic, if you believe that this 3% of GDP, we have to fix the fiscal deficit, that will have adverse consequences in terms of growth recovery process. Now take a look into this budget. What was the narrative? The size of the government, that is expenditure to GDP, that has gone up, but that increase in the size of government was utilized for enhancing capital spending. So when it is used for enhancing the capital spending, without giving adequate importance to the revenue spending, what exactly is the revenue spending? The revenue spending, we should focus on social infrastructure policies in health and education. We should focus on food security measures. We should focus on government acting as an employer of last resort. So when you don't focus on these aspects, which are very much important for the human capital formation in the economy, and you focus only on capital infrastructure investment, there is an issue. Otherwise, of course, I do believe that the multiplier effects of the capital infrastructure investment is huge when we look into that link between the capital infrastructure investment and the growth. That there is no doubt about it, of course, with a lagged effect. But my quarrel is that why it is at the cost of revenue spending. Why we are thinking that revenue spending in the time of pandemic is bad, and why we have curtailed the revenue spending. That's my quarrel. Because if you look into the components in the last budget, we can see that several components related to expenditure in the revenue account has been reduced. So that should not be the case, because that can also affect the financing human development aspects, which is very important. Otherwise, we are taking a strong economic paradigm that, it is economic growth, that's everything. It is not economic growth, that's everything. We have to think about beyond economic growth paradigm, incorporating the human financing elements into it. Otherwise, we are not talking about any sustainable goals, or we are not talking about any human capital formation. We are just talking about growth and thinking that this economic growth will translate into, a good human development in the economy or in the country. But that trickle down, or that translation of high GDP will not happen. So that's a punch you have to take, that we as macro policy makers, we should not be just focusing on economic growth recovery. Now, a moment, if I look into the economic growth recovery process, we need to understand that if the fiscal policy and the monetary policy, if we are designing the tools related to the central bank and the Ministry of Finance just from a counter-cyclical policy perspective, then we may not get an economic recovery to the prior pandemic levels. In the sense, we may not have a strict business cycle in the context of Indian economy. One moment. Excuse me. A strict business cycle in the sense, you take a look into, excuse me, you take a look into the works by Geeta Gopinath. Okay. And her works tell you that in the context of an emerging economy, strong business cycles we may not experience. In the sense, we cannot date, ups and downs, that cycles we cannot date. When an emerging economy doesn't experience, very solid or very concrete business cycles, then if you design the fiscal policy and monetary policy as a counter-cyclical policy tool, then that per se will not lead to growth recovery process. You're with me, right? Like if the economy, excuse me, if the economy is in the downturn, what is a counter-cyclical fiscal policy? You pump right. And when the economy is in the upturn, the size of the government you can reduce. And in the case of monetary policy, using the interest rate policy tool, you respond to the cycles in a counter-cyclical way. But, always economy doesn't experience, that business cycles. And if you focus on fiscal policy and monetary policy just as a counter-cyclical policy tool, then economy will not go back to the prior pandemic position. That's what I was trying to communicate. And that's why, if you look into, excuse me, it's a season change. I do this. Excuse me. Okay. So what I was trying to. Okay. What I was trying to tell you is, we should have two components to the economic stimulus package programs. One is, of course, tackling the counter-cyclicality by managing this instantaneous firefighting packages. That's very relevant. But we have to also look into the structural impediments in the economy. Structural impediments are very important, because otherwise this removing cyclicality will take the economy back to the prior pandemic position. That may not happen every time. Okay, that's why, the assumption is that the drop of your GDP from the trend, that drop is just cyclical or just transient, and using the policy we can take the economy back to the prior pandemic level. But when this drop in GDP is a permanent scar, then the monetary policy and fiscal policy, acting as a counter-cyclical policy tools, cannot remove that cyclicality, translating the cyclicality into the prior growth path will not happen. That's exactly what was my point. So how the fiscal deficit and the debt dynamics was maneuvered to meet these structural reforms in the economy. If you take a look into the numbers, the levels of the fiscal deficit, of course, there was a rethinking in the fiscal rules that 3% of GDP, the fiscal deficit, is not plausible. And now we have increased that assumption to 4.5% of GDP, and the roadmap towards that fiscal consolidation is by 2025-26. By 2025-26, we need to take back this high fiscal deficit to 4.5%. But you can ask me the question, why we are not going back to 3%? Maybe one of the reasons for doing that is we engaged in budget transparency exercise in the last budget. Budget transparency exercise in the sense, There was a huge issue in Kerala also, that why fiscal deficit doesn't reflect a kind of borrowing that's happening in the economy through public sector enterprises and corporate bodies. By definition, fiscal deficit need not include that borrowings that is happening through public sector enterprises or corporate bodies. And that is another concept of deficit, which is public sector borrowing requirement. And in India, we have not constructed a public sector borrowing requirement in that sense. So, in what way we can incorporate these elements of off-budget borrowings into fiscal deficit? There was a thought process behind that. And in last budget, not this February budget, in the last budget, there was an attempt to incorporate a part of OBB, off-budget borrowing, from the Food Corporation of India, you must be remembering that, into the budget, into the fiscal deficit. So if that is the case, if you're giving importance to the budget transparency by incorporating certain elements of OBB, then instead of 3%, you may think about a 4.5% as your target. So that may be one of the reasons. Otherwise, that fundamental disillusionment has happened, that this 3% of GDP, that fiscal deficit, that norm is not working well in the time of economic crisis or in the time of pandemic. And even Oliver Blanchard, students must be knowing him, in his writings, he also mentioned that in the time of economic recession or crisis, high debt and deficit can be substantiated by, substantiate how it can be substantiated the way we have done in India, either by articulating it, relating to high capital infrastructure investment or in reducing the output gap. Now, what exactly is output gap? Output gap is a difference between your potential output and actual output. What is potential output? That is the output that is aspirational, your aspiration, or what is that frontier of growth our economy can reach, our potential. And actual, output, you can understand that we have the GDP numbers, GVA plus Fisc, that is on board. But usually, economists arrive at this potential output by using an econometric methodology. In the sense, you take the GDP series, and GDP series has got cyclical elements and the trend component, right? So you, using some filter methodology, take out the cyclicality elements and call the trend component of the GDP as your potential GDP. But this potential output as a concept, that's a lot of controversies are there regarding that output, potential output. It's a very difficult macroeconomic variable. But central bank and fiscal authorities have been using the output gap as a crucial variable for macroeconomic formulations. But whether it is useful or not, when there is no strict business cycles, that we have to see. Because I mentioned that if the drop in the GDP is a permanent drop or a permanent scar, then the concept of output gap, that cyclicality, will not work, right? So these are the issues. And, students can take a look into the Fiscal Monitor published by IMF. That gives you a perspective about the global uncertainties and also about the macroeconomic variables across globe, like inflation, interest rate, global recovery path in terms of the GDP of various countries. So Fiscal Monitor, that's a very important document you can take a look into to understand about, how the economy is progressing. Now, it's a dual crisis. As I mentioned, I don't know that there will be another wave, peaking in June. Then what could be that policy in India should be followed from the fiscal policy front to respond to that? What could be that preparedness? That, if you ask me, then instead of thinking about the instantaneous fiscal risk, what you have to do is you have to increase the investment in health. sector. And we have not used this pandemic as an opportunity to increase the investment in the health sector. Our health sector expenditure, if you look into, it is just 0.8% of GDP. It is below 1% of GDP. And not in this budget. In the last budget, there was a huge announcement related to health sector that over the next 6 years, we are going to increase that, spending in the health by 64, lakh crore or 64 trillion, rupees. But the articulation that what is the financing pattern and how we are going to do that, those articulation were unclear. But in right now, the preparedness of our country should be, instead of doing ad hoc measures related to increase in the health spending by spending on vaccination, or it is like when the pandemic peaks, you respond to that crisis in a particular way, which is again ad hoc. Instead of doing that, if we can use this crisis as an opportunity to think clearly about the health sector and its preparedness in terms of personals, because there's a deficiency of personals in the health sector, and in terms of infrastructure in the primary, secondary, and tertiary health sectors, and in terms of R&D in the health sector, then that could be a wonderful investment, which is long-term in nature and which can prevent the mounting this health crisis as well. Otherwise, this mounting health crisis can, in turn, impact on macroeconomy, and it will be a prolonged macroeconomic crisis. So economic disruptions can be prevented if you take the health sector seriously. Because what are the other strategies which we tried? The other strategies were non-economic interventions, like we tried lockdown, night curfew, but the scientific explanation of the prolonged or the long-term impact of lockdown and night curfews, it's not as impactful as you focus on your health sector and the preparedness you have to deal with the pandemic by making people vaccinated and by making the health sector ready to respond to the pandemic. Otherwise, this lockdown could be a short-term strategy. Then once economy gets opened up, there will be irreversible disruptions in the economic sector, as well as we will not be able to flatten the curve beyond a point if you don't use that lockdown period to strengthen the health sector. So that's exactly my point. Why lockdown or night curfew alone cannot do wonders. It has to be combined with a huge investment in the health sector and the planning in the health sector. So that's a point. Otherwise, if the economic stimulus packages are focusing just on economic recovery without giving adequate emphasis to the social infrastructure, especially health, which I mentioned already, and education, you can understand that the digital divide is quite strong now. And the students are not able to access education because of the lack of access to internet and the systems. So we need to work on that front to get the students back to education, because the survey has shown that the effective enrollment rate, once you adjust for the availability or the access of students to the digital infrastructure, that we understand that that's a huge issue, and that led to drop in the enrollment ratio. So education sector is also very crucial, and it is not only about digital university, but we need to look into the issues from the demand side. How the students are getting affected because of this online education and their lack of access to the digital infrastructure. So instead of just focusing on economic recovery, what we have to do is we have to focus on social infrastructure, especially health and education, of course food security. And this emphasis on food security was quite reflected in the calculus of consent in the voting behavior of the people in the recent elections. In the recent elections, if you look into what determines the success, and you can understand that it was closely linked to the welfare models practiced by the governments in power. Because if you look into the voting models, people vote in retrospect. they look into the policies of the government, and if they are happy with it, they vote the government back to the power. And these welfare models has helped the governments to come back to power. It is not about majoritarianism, or it is not about caste or class, which determined the results of the political economy narratives of the elections, but the public finance, the public finance models practiced by the governments in the state, as well as the center government support to the people through the welfare, policies, that really influenced the calculus of consent of the people, when they came out to vote this time. But here, we need to understand that, these welfare models are okay, but these welfare models cannot sustain, given the fiscal space, it cannot sustain if it is going to be a long-term thing, because we need to find fiscal space for a prolonged welfare, models in the economy, but we don't have the fiscal space for that. That's why now, instead of the populist measures or this prolonged welfare models, governments should also start thinking about, generating employment, because in the time of pandemic, employment has declined. And, you can understand that the female labor force participation, if you look into, the numbers are not that great. So instead of focusing just on the populist measures, or if you look into the case of, Punjab and Delhi, the government, they have the tendency to announce certain freebies. But these will not be of long-term solution. You need to focus back on employment generation. And here, there are two kind of policies. It's a policy dilemma for a finance minister. Like, given the fiscal space, what could be an ideal model to use that fiscal space? Whether they should design participation income, or they should design, basic income. Participation income in the sense that people come out, participate in the economic activity, that is employment, and they earn an income. That is participation income. But on the other hand, government can give cash transfers into the hands of people. That cash transfers, you call it as basic income. It can be universal and it can be unconditional. So government of India has not engaged into, giving that huge macro fiscal stimulus programs in the form of basic income. The argument was that if people have the tendency or the propensity to save than the propensity to spend, then giving cash into the hands of people or helicopter dropping of money cannot stimulate the economy. So government was focusing on employer of last resort policies, but the concern is the allocation related to the employment of last policies was coming down. And in the recent budget also, you can understand that allocation is reduced. And the argument was that it is a demand-driven program. So when there is an increase in the demand, we will increase the allocation. But the argument goes like this: you have to increase the allocation or protect the allocation at the budget estimates level. Otherwise, the cyclicality of that program and the way you design, jobs to be guaranteed, and also the wage to be given at the T point of time, not with a lag, the wages to be given to the people who access the job guarantee scheme. So for all these things, protecting the employer of last resort policy allocation at the budget estimate level is quite crucial. So that argument is demand driven, and the fiscal space for employer of last resort policy can be enhanced when there is demand. That argument is flawed argument. So these are the concerns, and I mentioned about the fiscal risk, and one of the fiscal risk is related to the fiscal marksmanship of an economy. Marksmanship in the sense, in case of India, we don't have fiscal council to look into, or as a watchdog to look into the budget credibility. And what exactly is the budget credibility? The fiscal forecasting errors needs to be minimized. Like when finance minister announce, that announcement is your budget estimates. But whether announcements are not backed up by adequate allocation, then in the revised estimates, you can see there's a huge deviation between what you announced and what is actual. If there is a huge deviation between the budget estimates and revised estimates, and in turn the actuals, then your fiscal marksmanship is not perfect. And this can happen on the revenue side and the expenditure side. So what is that fiscal risk on expenditure side? Expenditure side, underutilization. Based on the state capacity and based on the absorption capacity at the subnational levels, you can see that many programs expenditure is announced, but it is unspent. So that deviation is there. And on the taxation side and on the revenue side, we have certain assumptions and projections related to taxes. And if there is a bias there in the policymaker in their assumptions and model building, then you can understand that will be a huge deviation between the projections, the forecast, and the actually realized tax. And you have seen in the recent budget that fiscal marksmanship or the fiscal forecasting errors were maximum in case of non-tax revenue or in terms of the capital receipt, especially the disinvestment proceeds. So that affects your fiscal arithmetic, because you thought that you will be able to enhance the fiscal space through privatization or through disinvestment proceeds. But privatization is never a quick fix for enhancing fiscal space, right? Because there are many things involved in privatization process in terms of your valuation, in terms of the pricing mechanisms, in terms of labor market repercussions. There are a lot of concerns related to the privatization process. So just announcing privatization as a quick fix for the fiscal proceeds or the fiscal space, that didn't work. And you know that we assume that we may get 2 lakh crore from privatization proceeds, but the numbers, if you look into, these are peanuts. And because all what has happened is only in the aviation sector, Air India, otherwise IPO, given the Ukraine and that war of Russia in Ukraine and how it affects the financial stability, then this IPO and the LIC, that also, we announced quite modest numbers we announced in this budget. But these uncertainties, global uncertainties, can affect our projections and our numbers and aspirations related to disinvestment or the privatization process this year also, even if the numbers are modest, because when compared to last 2 years, the government was quite modest or quite conservative in announcing the disinvestment proceeds. But these global uncertainties and this fiscal risk can affect the arithmetic, the fiscal arithmetic this time. So we have to wait and see how much that proceeds is going to increase given this uncertainties. But you cannot blame a policymaker if the fiscal forecasting errors, the source of fiscal forecasting errors, it is random. And technically, you can do an exercise to understand the fiscal forecasting errors in the sense, we have a study in NIPFP. We looked into the budget credibility of all the state governments and central government in India. And we also decomposed, trichotomize the fiscal forecasting errors into bias, variation, and random. So if that will come as 0 to 1 when you do that exercise, and if the component of randomness is relatively greater than the components of bias and variation, then you cannot blame budget makers or the bureaucrats in the Ministry of Finance for the budget forecast errors, because it happened random. It can happen random because of the price fluctuations, oil, many things, it can happen, the supply side shocks, and now the war. So there are different, factors that lead to fiscal forecasting errors. But At the same time, if it is happening through the bias, you can understand from the technique. I can send you that paper through Sarita. You take a look how you look into the budget credibility exercise, and that exactly is that fiscal risk assessment. Like across countries, if you look into the budget credibility and fiscal risk assessment, you have to play safe. How you can play safe? A government has to announce the budget estimates quite realistic. Otherwise, if there is a huge deviation between the budget estimates and next year revised estimates, then immediately we will be told that you are not credible. Your announcements are not your real actual values. So why there is a deviation between the budget estimates and the actual values? So in order to prevent that fiscal forecasting errors, maybe that's a reason why government was quite realistic now in terms of their tax projection announcements and the disinvestment proceeds announcement. But whether it is an underestimate or not, whether it is below the capacity of a state or a center government to collect the taxes, that's yet another question, whether you are aspiring for below potential. But I do believe that RE will be greater than BE in case of the tax, because this year also taxes were very buoyant. It was beyond expectations. But that is a high frequency data, but we need to see the long-term trend with relate to GST and other tax components, whether taxes are really, really buoyant. But this tax buoyancy helped us to control the fiscal deficit from that 9.2. Last year, the fiscal deficit was 9.2, right? But right now, we were able to control the fiscal deficit from 9.2 to 6.8. What we pegged for this year was 6.9, but we could reach up to 6.8. And this current year, we pegged for 6.4. And by 25-26, we are supposed to bring this down to 4.5%. And even the state governments, a kind of fiscal transfers happened, like interest free, that 1 lakh crore was given to the state governments for a front loading of capital infrastructure, because macroeconomic uncertainties, states and center face, and we need to support the state governments also, because earlier it was a kind of entitlement, the transfer of funds from center to the states. But this rethinking in the cooperative federalism and asking states or nudging states to play in the markets and earn their receipts, this kind of nudging experiments in the cooperative federalism is very new in the context of India. So states are equally exposed to the macroeconomic uncertainties. And, two things that has happened from this budget, where one is, of course, the transfer of 1 lakh crore to the state governments for a front loading of the capital infrastructure spending. And other is fiscal deficit ratio we mentioned to the GDP, right? For the center, we were planning to bring it down to 4.5, but center's fiscal, the deficit to GDP right now is 6.4. That's what we are pegging. But in the states, it was enhanced from 3% of GDP to 4%. But again, based on conditionalities. Within that 4%, 0.5% of the extra borrowing space given to the states is based on their performance-linked reforms in the power sector. Power sector is in doldrums. You can understand that, power sector, in India, we have sufficient electricity generated to go for 100% electrification of Indian villages. But why we are unable to do that? Because the distribution companies, that's in loss. We need to support them. And, if you look into the financial efficiency parameters and the operational parameters of the power sector or the discom companies, we have done a study in NIPFP on power sector as well. We looked into this data which was available, the dashboard data which was available with the Ministry of Power, and looked into the financial parameters and operational efficiency parameters. And across states, we identified that despite state governments helping the power sector distribution companies to clean up their mess, that deteriorated state finances. But the efficiency has not improved. If you look into the tariff revisions, or if you look into reducing the aggregate technical and commercial loss, theft is also happening. You can understand that the technical loss that's happening in the power sector, and also the gap between the aggregate cost and aggregate revenue, that gap is also quite wide. So financial parameters are not okay in the case of power sector. So if you are very serious about the power sector reforms, then the 0.5% of the extra borrowing space given to the states can be availed. But this nudging experiments for the state governments to enhance their fiscal space through enhancing the borrowing space, that nudging experiments failed 2 years back because states got over adjusted to the fiscal rules, and they were not even going for any reforms to avail the extra borrowing space. But right now, government is hopeful that some kind of structural reforms will happen in the economy related to the power sector. And it is not only power sector. When we talk about the structural reforms, it's also about the labor market. It's also about the two balance sheet crisis, right? We have balance sheet crisis, bank balance sheet, the corporate balance sheet. So there's a twin balance sheet crisis, and how you respond to that is also equally important. Recapitalization is not a solution every time. Like you recapitalize the banks to keep up to the Basel norms of that capital adequacy ratio. Every time you cannot flush that money, that recapitalization cannot happen, and there should be other parameters to improve the efficiency of the banking sector. Now, my last point is, what are the innovations that has happened in the Indian economy recently? One innovation is we tried digital, going digital. Even we announced the CBDC, the central bank digital currency, and the crypto, that assets, the taxation policy, 30% of the crypto dealings, that's going to happen. And another innovation is you emphasized on, climate change commitments. The greening of fiscal policy happened. That's also for the first time ever, government seriously thinking about, the green policies or climate change commitments. Now, let me unpack these two innovative announcements quickly, and then we can open the floor and students can ask me questions and we can interact. Let me begin with the crypto and CBDC. What exactly is this crypto transaction? It is a high risk, high return asset, and it is based on decentralized finance. And government mentioned that 30% of these transactions will be taxed. And the question was whether taxing the crypto make it legitimate, or make it legal. These were the questions. But the clarification by the tax official is that no, it doesn't make it legal or legitimate. Those kind of legal statute and the bill that is in the making, and that process will happen in due course. So taxing happened before getting into those legal or the statutes regarding the crypto. But my hunch is there will not be any ban of crypto in the context of India, because banning means you're saying no to a financial innovation, because we should be comfortable with the evolution process that is happening in the money and finance. And if it is helping the entrepreneurs, or if it is giving them confidence for cross-border transactions and all, we should help the entrepreneurial class, and we should support that behavior of that particular group of business people. They believe in high risk, high return asset. So we should support them so that fraudulence will not happen there, and it will happen based on trust, and there will be financial integrity. So I mentioned about the regulatory framework, which is important, but banning, because central bank governor was giving some right noises about how fickle crypto transactions can be, and he was like comparing it to tulip. It does not have even the value of the tulips. So he's making some right noises regarding how it can affect the financial stability of our economy. Okay, but my hunch is it will not be banned, it will be regulated. Let's wait and see. Now, compare it with CBDC. central bank digital currency. That is a legalized tender, digital tender. It is like we don't print money and all, that printing cost and all reduced, and you're doing the transactions digitally. It's welcome, provided who is accessing the digital infrastructure, because there is a digital divide in our economy, right? Everybody don't have access to the digital economy. So if you solve all these issues related to access of people to the digital infrastructure, we can think about the digital transactions. That's quite welcome. And CBDC, the central bank digital currency, is it's not decentralized. Okay, the moment we talk about central bank, then it is not a decentralized currency. But anonymity, the data privacy, these are very crucial when we talk about the central bank digital currency, because how much information can be extracted when we use the CBDC as a medium of exchange, because Sarita and me may go in a globe trotting, and whether central bank needs to know about our details, how we globe trot if you're using the CBDC as our medium of transaction. So that data privacy is crucial for us, right? So we have to manage many elements related to the CBDC. Like, one is data privacy, second is financial integrity, third is, of course, it's a legal tender, so it's legitimate. You don't have to worry about that. And you can take a look into the works by Barry Aiken-Green. He mentioned about the digital dollar, and in that paper, he quoted, he cited Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen's, a few comments regarding digital currency or the digital dollar. And digital dollar she supported because she was a central bank governor, chair as well of this Fed Reserve, right? So what she mentioned was that it's quite okay in terms of financial inclusion, because when the regions, a certain part of the country, when in those regions when there is no heavy penetration of the banking sectors, then this digital currency can be an advocate more to financial inclusion. That's what she highlighted regarding the digital currency. Of course, again, it depends on the digital divide, how you tackle that in the country. And second, they have huge macro fiscal announcement in terms of pandemic checks, in the hands of people in the form of cash transfers and child credit and all, right? So she was thinking that, how can I access people? The digital dollar may be an adequate way for the fiscal monetary policy coordination to reach people in the time of pandemic, to maneuver this economic stimulus packages. So these are the positive things she mentioned. But in that paper, you can also take a look into the Fed wire. That's a kind of institutional framework they have to follow up the transactions. But what is that institutional framework and the regulatory framework in our country to do this follow-up process? Of course, the TDS for the crypto, like the tax deducted at the source, that could be one way to track it, because the moment you do a transaction, the tax is deducted at the source, and then you have to pay on the top of that the 30% tax. And where is this 30% coming from? Because usually the speculative assets, because this is a speculative asset, it's not a legal tender or a currency, it's a speculative asset, crypto. And 30% is a tax which is given to any speculative assets, whether it's gambling or whether it is horse race or anything. Speculative assets, we do the taxation up to 30%. So that's what this 30%, where it is coming from, you may be wondering, and this is a way. But as Stiglitz pointed out, taxing a speculative asset, what exactly is the narrative here? Whether you are taxing or whether you are using the taxation policy to curb a speculative activity in the economy, which has got its repercussions on the financial stability, or whether you're making it legitimate or venerable or respectable or dignified, you don't know, because tax officials increasingly pointed out that that's not the case. We are not taxing it to make it legitimate. So we have to wait and see, because these are new announcements. And I mentioned about the climate change commitments against the backdrop of the Glasgow commitments, and we need to go towards a net, zero carbon, target. And monetary policy getting into the commitments of the climate change, that is quite controversial because economists are divided. And Rekuram Rajan, many economists, they express their opinion that monetary policy does not have enough policy kits or the tool kits to get into, distinguish between your green bond and the brown bond when you go for the stock investment decisions. And that can go little political if you get into those kinds of distinction between the investment decisions. And this climate risk and uncertainties, to them, that group of economists is not the cup of tea of, monetary policy makers, because their argument is monetary policy should be focusing on price stability, inflation containment, and financial stability, not climate change commitments. But it is refuted from the perspective that the climate change related risk and uncertainties can affect your financial stability. So Bank of England and European Central Bank, Christine Lagarde, she is the chief of that European Central Bank, right? So there are many central banks which have gone ahead in terms of greening monetary policy by announcing green stress test to the top banks or the top investment decisions. But at the same time, RBI is quite open to it, but we need to wait and see what kind of, decisions they will take regarding this green stress test. We have to wait and see. And related to fiscal policy, there is a kind of unanimity in the decision that fiscal policy can tackle climate change commitments or, can respond. In the sense, one is climate responsive budgeting, like how much country is spending on mitigation, adaptation. We have to extract it out of the budget, and we need to find the gaps in the investment process. The commitments and the fiscal, decisions regarding the budgets, that gap needs to be found out. Another thing is we announced a green bond. That's a fiscal instrument in the sense, the financing pattern of deficit, if we look into in India, the predominant form of financing the deficit is your bond financing. And within the bond financing, it is earmarked. The green bond means earmarking a certain component of the bond financing to a specific purpose. Here it is green infrastructure. And this kind of earmarking of the bond financing is first experiment in the context of India. But in Colombia, there was earmarking of the bond financing for addressing the gender concerns. They have a gender bond, just like the way India announced green bond. So this also opened a question in order to address the sustainable development goals, whether we can get into thematic bonds like green bonds, gender bonds, in addition to the public financial management tools we have in India, like gender budgeting and all, right? And the climate responsive budgeting and all. So these are the innovative things that has happened. And the final word is the way fiscal risk is going to get examined is mainly from the perspective of budget credibility, and mainly from the perspective of how you articulate your fiscal rules in the country and how you stick on to those threshold fiscal rules. So these are the ways in which a country is going to get examined or tested based on the credibility issues or the fiscal risk. And Sarita, now we can open the floor. I stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am, for
Thank you, ma'am.
giving your valuable insight. It was a fruitful collaboration. So with that, we will go ahead and take some time for questions. Anyone can ask question directly or can raise queries in the chat box. So I request each one of you to make use of this exciting opportunity, please.
What happened? മലയാളത്തിലും ചോദിച്ചോളൂ കേട്ടോ. ഞാൻ മലയാളത്തിൽ ഉത്തരം പറയാം. ഭാഷയ്ക്ക് എനിക്ക് വലിയ സ്നേഹമുള്ള ഒരാളാണ്. ഞാൻ ഇംഗ്ലീഷിൽ ഇങ്ങനെ ഒന്ന് സ്റ്റാൻഡർഡൈസ് ചെയ്ത് പറഞ്ഞേ ഉള്ളൂ. സ്റ്റുഡൻസ് ക്യാൻ ആസ്ക് മീ ക്വസ്റ്റൻസ് ഇൻ മലയാളം. ഞാൻ മലയാളത്തിൽ ഉത്തരം പറയാം. ടേംസ് മേ ബി ഞാൻ ഇംഗ്ലീഷിൽ പറയുമെങ്കിലും മലയാളത്തിൽ ഉത്തരം പറയാം.
Good morning, ma'am.
Tell me.
Yeah, I am Pratibha. Government on call. Can you hear me, ma'am?
Yeah, Pradipha. Yes, I can hear you. I can
Yes.
see you also. Yeah.
Ma'am, I want to know about the cryptocurrency, how it actually functions.
You know, my expertise is not on,
Okay, then it's fine.
Yeah.
Ma'am, I have another question. You were talking about basic income.
Hmm?
We had this concept being discussed in Economic Survey 2016 or something. So, but it was not heard about much after that. Is it very costly to implement basic income in our country?
Okay. Sarita, ഞാൻ ക്വസ്റ്റൻസ് കളക്ട് ചെയ്തിട്ട് ഒരുമിച്ച് പറയണോ അതോ വൺ ബൈ വൺ ആയിട്ട് എടുക്കണോ?
As you prefer, ma'am. I think one by one will be better because your presentation itself was so vivid and clear. So only after analyzing in mind later on, after 1 hour, some questions may arise. Now I think everything is clear with your presentation.
Okay. So let me go one by one. Then Pradipha's question, let me take. For her first question was on cryptocurrency. It's a new area of research, ഞാൻ ഇത് ബജറ്റ് അനൗൺസ്മെന്റിന്റെ അപ്പം മുതൽ ഈ താല്പര്യത്തോടു കൂടി ഇത് പഠിക്കാൻ തുടങ്ങിയത്. അപ്പോ ഈ ക്രിപ്റ്റോ കറൻസി ഓഫ് കോഴ്സ് ഇറ്റ്സ് what do you call the high risk high return asset. Appo this is not a broad based taxation policy at all, the taxing the crypto. Okay, so what government focused was that in the time of COVID pandemic, using taxation as a policy tool to enhance the fiscal space has not happened because we have not increased the tax rate, but we have not decrease the tax rate or increase the tax rate. Phone we have not touched the taxation at all in the time of pandemic to increase the fiscal space. And there were many debates like, why don't you increase that top 1% of the income class, that wealth tax, and why don't you touch the corporate taxation? Otherwise there is an uneven recovery, and why can't you use that? That's one kind of argument. On the other side, why don't you reduce the taxes that's affecting the low, the small firms? Why don't you decrease the corporate tax further for the business firms which are below the certain threshold? Because the effective taxation, if you look into the business taxation, that's higher for the firms who are below a certain threshold of the turnover, not the big giants or the big industries. That's one thing. But we have not got into the taxation side at all to respond to the pandemic to increase the fiscal space. Now the crypto is taxed. The question is how crypto function, that blockchain, that fintech, all those details, we are not going to get into the details right now. But it's based on a kind of anonymity that you keep, you transfer the money in wallets, and there could be a kind of illicit transaction if the people can park the money in the wallet in abroad, and if they can spend there, how it is going to get tracked. So there are a lot of ways in which there could be because it's anonymity, and the decentralized finance is the backbone of the crypto transactions. So there can be certain aspects related to lack of financial integrity which can occur in the case of crypto. But how you have to regulate that, that's an important concern. So but it is not a broad-based tax at all, because it's based on the fiscal behavior or the the savings behavior or that risk behavior. You enter into high risk, high return assets. Because if you ask me, I may not get into a high risk, high return asset, because hard-earned money, I may not do a gambling or a speculation with that, but a certain group of business community, they do believe that, we will do a kind of, it's a kind of gambling only. It's kind of, transactions which earn us high returns. So the government's role is not to ban that, in the sense, this transactions getting digitized, and if it is smoothened as a medium of exchange, because store of value is what I am questioning, because their high fluctuations are there. So if it's a medium of transaction, then how that process can be smoothened using the regulatory framework is only the degrees of freedom we have as policy maker. Otherwise, we have to take a step to ban the crypto, which is against, financial innovation, because you're saying no to an innovation. So as an economist, I do believe that saying no to an innovation and no to support the entrepreneurial class who believes in high, risk and high return, that kind of a business behavior, that lack of giving support to that is not, to me, that doesn't look good. But a central bank's governance perspective is always from the financial stability perspective. So this can lead to financial instability. So I know where it is coming from when he speak about, lack of interest, or almost he's talking about banning the cryptocurrency. But the North Bloc and the central bank, how they are going to do this, we have to wait and see. There are a lot of deliberations that's happening. And, mining the crypto and transacting the crypto are two things. And in India, mining of the cryptos are not that huge. So energy efficiency, because in other countries, when they took the decisions regarding the regulatory framework, the energy efficiency was also one of the crucial concerns. So there are various elements to be looked into, like energy efficiency, decisions, then fiscal monetary policy coordination, then financial integrity, the regulatory mechanism. So these are the components we have to wait and see how it is going to get played out. Otherwise, saying no to crypto and saying no to smooth transactions cross border, thinking that it may lead to illicit transactions, that's a great assumption. That's what I feel. So I'm for crypto, not for banning it, but to regulate it. Yeah. And second question regarding the basic income. Of course, our former, chief economic advisor, Arvind Subramaniam, he emphasized the basic income, universal basic income. But we have not taken that seriously. But all we have done is we have designed only the targeted, cash transfers into the hands of people, especially providing 9,000 rupees. That's a targeted cash transfer or a targeted basic income for farmers. And as a part of pandemic package, we also announced 500 rupees in the hands of women who were in the care economy sector. But these were just tokenism. And these are not, great examples of basic income transfer. But there is a, economies are divided regarding this use of fiscal space for employer of last resort policy or basic income. And I understand that, it's a huge priority for Abhijit Banerjee, and Kaushik Basu, economists like him, and Arvind Subramaniam. They all mentioned about the basic income into the hands of people when there is livelihood crisis, when there is migration crisis. So this is the only way in which we can tackle the issues that relate to humanitarian crisis. So why don't you have a judicious mix of basic income and participation income? So that's an important question. But basic income can always be a short term, because heterodox economists, the CDS, Levy Economic Institute, Kansas, we do believe that more than basic income, it is the employer of last resort policies. The job guarantee schemes can be a wonderful policy response to the any crisis. So we have to give importance to employment generation in the economy rather than focusing on the basic income. But of course, in the time of pandemic, for the short time period, it's welcome. But the question is, where is the money? Where is the fiscal space? And now we know that revenues are uncertain and we cannot do an expenditure compression. We tried increasing the fiscal space through disinvestment, which has not worked. So what is left for us? Can you guess what is a way in which we can increase the fiscal space when all these experiments failed? Only way is monetization of deficit. Like your rate of interest in real rate of interest is greater than the real rate of growth of economy. You compare these two. Students can take a look into the data. And if the real rate of interest is higher than real rate of growth of economy, then what does it mean? The cost of credit is higher than the rate in which your economy is growing. Then you are in trouble. Then you have to eventually monetize your deficit, because bond financing cannot go on when R is greater than G. But now it is called a free lunch. Our R is not greater than G. If the R is not greater than G, then what is the concept? You may have high fiscal deficit, but you are growing out of your debt because your growth of economy is greater than the cost of credit or the R. So you can grow out of your debt. You're using the debt for the right purpose. Otherwise, you get into fiscal profligacy, or you may not get, advocate growth recovery. But if you use your public debt correctly, then you enhance the fiscal space and you grow out of it. Your economy recovery can happen through investing properly, investing in human capital formation, investing in reducing the output gap, and also strengthening, the capital infrastructure. In that way, you grow out of the crisis and then you can repay. And the concern here is, if the interest payments to revenue receipt, if that ratio is above 40% or something, then you are ultimately using your revenue receipts to pay back the past debt. That should not happen. So that growth process needs to be given emphasis. Otherwise, you will not grow. I mean, your economy will not grow, but at the same time, you have the debt burden in which you continuously repay your past debt. That can happen. So these are the concerns I have regarding that debt dynamics, and of course that use of space, whether it is participation income or basic income. That all depends upon the way you decide on your fiscal space. And monetization of deficit, India has not yet decided, because we had monetization of deficit till late 80s, but that led to fiscal profligacy, and that led to increase in the inflationary pressures. So printing money in the sense you use the ad hoc treasury bills to increase the fiscal space. So that's a way. But whether we can do that through the ad hoc treasury bills, we can increase the fiscal space, or we can increase that monetization of deficit. But there are economists who believe that monetization of deficit is crucial this moment. But IMF, that paper, you can take a look, because why monetization of deficit is a taboo in the context of pandemic, whether we should be rethinking about monetization of deficit. So we have to see. But right now, government of India is thinking that it's an error on the side of caution, because we should not be fiscally profligate. We should not be overdoing the stimulus packages. So these are the vocabulary when I listen to the economists who work very close with the government, that India has not done any overstimulation packages or anything. We have done it correct. Otherwise, look at US, they are overheating and all. But my answer to these responses is that where is the money to support the people who are fighting for survival? What is your response to uneven recovery in India? Because India is not growing for everyone. So when there is an uneven recovery, don't say that you don't have money. Please tackle the elements which led to this uneven recovery by focusing on people who are at the lowest rung of the pyramid. So for that, we need to frame policies. We cannot say that we have done credit infusion as a predominant way to tackle the COVID pandemic. But Stiglitz also pointed out that credit-related economic stimulus packages cannot be everything. It has got limited multiplier effects, because who is accessing the credit? It is definitely not the poor firms. So the gap in the policy right now is, we have not announced anything substantial for the people in the lowest rung of the pyramid and the small business firms. And I hope that outside the purview of budget, now there is supplementary demand for grants, and I think government will come up with some kind of substantive measures to tackle the uneven growth recovery process. Otherwise, there are concerns. That's a crucial question. And there, where is the money, if you ask? That's going to be very cruel. So that's all I want to say. I work with the think tank of Ministry of Finance, but I thought that I will highlight this issue, and I hope the government will come up with some policies. Yes.
Thank you so much, ma'am.
Any more question? Those who are reluctant to ask questions directly can also raise the questions in the chat box.
Ma'am,
Yeah.
I have another question. That is, rural market ആണ് നമ്മളുടെ ഇന്ത്യൻ ഇക്കോണമിയിൽ ഇപ്പോൾ ഏറ്റവും കൂടുതൽ ടാർഗറ്റ് ചെയ്യുന്നതെന്ന് പറഞ്ഞു കോർപ്പറേറ്റ്സ് മാർക്കറ്റിംഗിൽ. കാരണം അവിടുത്തെ പോപ്പുലേഷൻ ആണ് മോർ എന്നുള്ളതുകൊണ്ട്. അപ്പം പക്ഷെ അവിടെ റൂറൽ ഏരിയയിലുള്ള ജോബ് ജനറേഷൻ, എംപ്ലോയ്മെന്റ് ജനറേഷൻ അതുപോലെ വീക്കാണ്. അപ്പം ആ ഒരു സിറ്റുവേഷനിൽ ഈ പാൻഡമിക്കിനെ നമ്മൾ ഓവർകം ചെയ്ത് നമ്മളൊരു നോർമലിലേക്ക് വരണം എന്നുണ്ടെങ്കിൽ അവർക്ക് കിട്ടേണ്ട പർച്ചേസിംഗ് പവർ, അവരുടെ ഭാഗത്ത് നിന്ന് വരേണ്ട പർച്ചേസിംഗ് പവർ എങ്ങനെ ജനറേറ്റ് ആവും? ദേ ആർ നോട്ട് ബീങ് എംപ്ലോയ്ഡ്. അപ്പം പെട്ടെന്ന് നമുക്കിപ്പോൾ ആവശ്യമുള്ളത് അവർക്ക് അവരുടെ ഇമ്മീഡിയറ്റ് ആയിട്ട് അവരുടെ കയ്യിലേക്ക് ആ പർച്ചേസിംഗ് പവർ എത്തിക്കുക എങ്കിലല്ലേ കുറച്ച് പെട്ടെന്ന് ഇക്കോണമി റിക്കവർ ആവും എന്നല്ലേ പറയുന്നത്. ഓരോ ദേ ആർ ദ പൂർ, മോസ്റ്റ് ഓഫ് ദ പൂർ ഗെറ്റ് കോൺസെൻട്രേറ്റഡ് ദ. അപ്പം അവരുടെ കയ്യിൽ ഇൻകം കിട്ടിയാൽ ദേ ആർ നോട്ട് ഗോയിങ് ടു സേവ്, ദേ ആർ ഗോയിങ് ടു കൺസ്യൂം ഫോർ ഡെഫിനിറ്റ്. ഒരു ഇത് വെച്ചിട്ടാണ് ഞാൻ ചോദിച്ചത്. ബേസിക് ഇൻകം എന്നുള്ള കോൺസെപ്റ്റ് അവിടെ for the time being, why can't the government use that concept here?
Good. That exactly is the flaw of economic stimulus packages we have designed. You rightly mentioned that demand side is not stimulated yet. We are focusing on the supply side. If you look at the pandemic packages designed by the central bank, we have focused on credit infusion, as I mentioned. And there were several toolkits, like Operation Twist, that was like simultaneous buying and selling of securities, like short-term securities കൂടുതൽ വിറ്റിട്ട് long-term securities കൂടുതൽ വാങ്ങി എന്തിനു വേണ്ടിയിട്ട്? Debt at the maturity structure of that bond market elongate ചെയ്യാനായി. That means refinancing risk ഒന്നും immediate അല്ല. We have to refinance it after a particular period of time, so that liquidity infusion is perfect. Either a policy, when a rate of interest was kept lower, thinking that for the rural people or the women or for the poor people, including poor people, rate of interest, if it is kept lower, that can lead to growth recovery. Pakshe, our assumption korchu wrong aanu. As Pradeepa rightly pointed out, for the poor people, central bank lowering the interest rate means they are getting the cost of credit cheaper. Pakshe, for poor people and for medium and small enterprises, access to the credit market is equally important. And access to the credit and cost to the credit, if you look into these two parameters, what are the process in which you provide access to the credit? Karanam collateral illande onnum pattilla. So when it comes to small business firms, women, poor people, where is the collateral? Because they are landless, right? Appo collateral illande oru nadapadiila access to credit sambhavikkunnilla. Appo cost of credit versus access to the credit la government excuse me government പ്രാധാന്യം കൊടുത്തിരിക്കുന്നത് cost of credit. Let the credit be cheaper, people will access. പക്ഷേ if you look at the rural credit markets, as you rightly mentioned, rural credit markets in the dynamics, women and poor people, അവര് ബാങ്ക് കൊടുക്കുന്ന ലോൺ ആക്സസ് ചെയ്യുന്നുണ്ട്, ക്രെഡിറ്റ് ആക്സസ് ചെയ്യുന്നുണ്ട്. പക്ഷേ പ്രതിഭ മെൻഷൻ ചെയ്ത പോലെ അവരുടെ പ്രോഡക്ട്സിന് മാർക്കറ്റ് ഇല്ലെങ്കിൽ, the demand, disposable income in the hands of people, if when it is not high, then how they repay this credit they have taken. അപ്പൊ ആ റീപേയ്മെന്റിന് വേണ്ടിയിട്ട് ഇവർ പിന്നെ ഒരു പോൺസി ഫൈനാൻസ് ചെയ്യേണ്ടി വരും. ലൈക്ക് ഇൻഡിജിനസ് മണി ലെൻഡേഴ്സിന്റെ അടുത്തുനിന്ന് പിന്നെയും വലിയ പലിശ നിരക്കിൽ കടമെടുത്തിട്ട് they may repay. So you are getting access to the cheap credit in the first round, but using that credit you have to have some market or some economic activity, and there should be demand in the system, whether people demand for your product. Where is that disposable income? What you're doing to stimulate the demand of the people? These are the questions raised by Pradipha. Appo idu sambhavichillengil, this credit infusion, when it is a predominant narrative of your economic stimulus package, how it's going to work? True, that concern is real. I do share. I can't agree with you more that if that is happening, and that exactly is happening, because if you look into the credit deployment statistics, the access to the credit and EPW issue on budget special issue, I think it's next week it will be up. You take a look into the articles there, ഈ concerns ഒക്കെ ഉണ്ട്. അപ്പോ പിന്നെ അതിനകത്ത് വേറൊരു കാര്യം കൂടി ഞാൻ പറയുന്നത്, ഫിനാൻഷ്യൽ സ്റ്റെബിലിറ്റി, ദാറ്റ് റിപ്പോർട്ട് പബ്ലിഷ്ഡ് ബൈ RBI, ആ റിപ്പോർട്ടിൽ there is stress statistics. Stress scenario, the mounting NPA, non-performing assets, that's a real concern. Because right now, if you look into the statistics, itrayum credit deployment announce cheyidu, whether that is leading to more and more NPAs or not, that was a question. Because there is no corresponding growth of credit in the economy, right? Growth in the economy. Appo, right now, if you look into the NPA, non-performing assets, അത് കുറച്ച് കുറഞ്ഞിട്ടുണ്ട്. എന്തുകൊണ്ടാവാം? Forbearance, moratoriums. There were several announcements which led to the cleansing up process of the NPA for the short term. But for the long term, it's mounting. And this is exactly what was discussed in that which stimulus package works in the Stiglitz paper. അതിൽ നോക്കുമ്പോഴേ നമുക്ക് കാണാം ക്രെഡിറ്റിന് പ്രാധാന്യം കൊടുത്താൽ ഉണ്ടാകുന്ന ദോഷങ്ങൾ that can lead to mounting NPAs, that can also lead to uneven access of the credit. അപ്പോൾ ഒരുപാട് കാര്യങ്ങളുണ്ട് if you don't look into the demand side, and that point is taken. That's why it is linked to that question related to the basic income also. The real concern is എങ്ങനെ നമുക്ക് disposable income into the hands of the people can be increased. That's where the thought process came from when you talked about the basic income. But the government is not in a mood to transfer the money into the hands of the people. Rather they're going this way. Economy is definitely growing, but it's not growing for the poor people. And there, this cash transfer that is pointed out by developmental economists, like for a short time period, cash transfer, targeted cash transfer may be a solution. But targeted cash transfer, what we announced, as I mentioned earlier, it was only for the farmers and that short-term period, for the women in the care economy. So these are real concerns, like a demand side stimulated when we focus just on, but it was like, argued with vigor by many economists, like, our economy is not overheated, that there is, things are working, but we need to ask again and again, working for whom? Inflation may mount, but of course, we have an inflation targeting framework in our country. We can anchor the inflation expectations. So given that inflation expectations framework and the inflation targeting framework on board, fiscal policy can be little more proactive in supporting, the poor by providing money. But we are thinking that leads to further inflation. But that all depends upon how you anchor the inflationary expectations. And that's exactly the point I mentioned in the beginning also. RBI is in a dilemma, like if they have to increase the interest rate to anchor the inflationary expectations. And when they increase the interest rate, of course, financialization of savings can happen, because now savings rate are coming down like anything. Everybody cannot save in crypto. So we are saving in our term deposits in the bank. But right now, if the repo rate, the official interest rate is 4% in our country, and if inflation is beyond the comfort zone, that is 6% is a comfort zone in India. Now it's mounting to above 6%. So you can understand that India is in a really negative real rate of interest. So negative real rate of interest വെച്ചാൽ നമ്മളെ ബാങ്കിലിടുന്ന പൈസ അതുപോലും തിരിച്ചു കിട്ടില്ല, because the rate of interest is negative. So these are the concerns, and people started diversifying their savings. So for financialization of savings, for preventing the capital flight, to address to the inflation, mounting inflation, you have to be hawkish by increasing the interest rate. But central bank is not in a mood to do that, to keep the cost of credit lower for the access of people to the credit, thinking that cost of credit is valuable than access to credit. But cost of credit, lowering the cost of credit does not have any one-to-one relationship with the growth recovery process. So that's it.
Thank you, ma'am.
Any more questions?
Binduja, ma'am is having another session in the afternoon. Okay, shall we wind up?
Okay,
SMG
ma'am.
College, ma'am is having
Okay.
another session. Yeah.
Thank you, ma'am. Now, I would like to call upon Maya, ma'am, Assistant Professor of Economics Department, to deliver the vote of thanks. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you, Binduja. Good afternoon to one and all. It is such an honor for me to get the opportunity to thank you all dignitaries. First of all, I extend my sincere thanks to our principal, Dr. V.M. Anandakumar sir, for providing immense support to make the international conference successful. Next, I would like to extend my sincere gratitude to our honorable chief guest, Dr. Lekha Chakraborty ma'am, to take out time from her busy schedule to grace the event. Thank you, madam, for enlightening our knowledge about the topic fiscal risk and global uncertainties with your words on this day. On behalf of the Department of Economics, VTM NSS College, I would like to extend my thanks to you, ma'am. Next, I must thank the coordinators of the international conference. Actually, they're working hard for the past few days to make this conference successful. And a special thanks to Sarada teacher to get Lekha ma'am as our chief guest. Last but not least, I extend my gratitude to all the participants for their active participation. Thank you everyone once again for making it a great success. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. So we have come to the end of our session. I would like to thank each one of you for sparing your valuable time to be here with us. I also thank Dr. Lekha ma'am for her valuable talk. Thank you all once again for joining us, and we will see you next time. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, Sarita. Thank you so much. All the best for the students. Thank you.